Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, there is a lot of questions right now that are being directed at the Ukrainian military. And that question is the Ukrainian army, the ground forces, the elements of the Ukrainian National Guard, Marine Naval Infantry units, is the Ukrainian military on the verge of collapse? So first we have to ask, why would that question be posed? Why would that question be asked? Is the Ukrainian military on the verge of collapse? Obviously, in the early days of the conflict, the Ukrainian armed forces had a very high level of esprit de corps. One of the key successes of the Ukrainian military, again in the early days of the conflict, was its high level of morale. It was a very well-trained force. At least some of the military units were very well-trained, obviously by U.S. and other NATO allies. But what does that look like now? The Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian ground forces, the territorial forces, look much different today than they did over a year ago. For one, the age of the average soldier now exceeds over 40 years old. And as I've talked about before, Grafenwehr, here in the United States, we have confirmed Ukrainian soldiers, privates, showing up ready for training that are aged 50, 60, and in one case, one confirmed case, the gentleman was 70 years old. Grandfather. Many grandfathers are serving now in the Ukrainian military. So we're seeing that age transition from a very young force, 20s, 30s, at the beginning of the conflict, to a much more aged force. And that's because of casualties. And that is because of desertion, fleeing Ukraine. One of the largest content providers that U.S. citizens watch here in the United States is this Denis Davidov. Denis Davidov apparently disguised himself as a woman and fled to Switzerland to avoid military service in Ukraine. He's a very healthy, fighting-age male in his 30s with advanced aviation skill sets. You would think that that individual would be wanting to serve his nation state. It's not the case. He's gotten out for a number of reasons. The primary one is he doesn't want to die. The casualty rates that we're seeing on the front lines are absolutely appalling for Ukrainian forces. Look, I get the Ukrainians are talking about how many Russians they are slaughtering, and this is coming from Kiev. But the reality on the ground, what is actually happening, is much different than what is being said by the media narrative. As I talked about before, the Ukrainians are fighting the third largest air force in the world. The Russians are hitting the Ukrainians with up to 100 sorties per day with ground attack aircraft. every day. Every single day, the Russians are hitting the Ukrainians with its air force, and it's taking a toll. Furthermore, at the start of the conflict, Ukrainian military brigades were staffed on average between 70 and 90% personnel strength per brigade. As we speak now, as we watch what is happening now, Ukrainian brigades, on average, are at about 30 to 40%. 30 to 40% to strength. If we look in Avdiivka, you can see we have the 110th Mechanized Brigade. We have the 53rd Mechanized Brigade. But we also have parceled out units, such as the 468th Separate Rifle Battalion, 70th Separate Infantry Battalion, and one of the reasons we're seeing the parceling out of these battalions in Avdiivka and other areas along the front line is because they are starting to break up some of these brigades and sending battalions that are at relatively better strength, in which they have infused those battalions with other elements of those brigades. So they're robbing Peter to essentially pay Paul, and Paul becomes this new battalion set. Now, another very serious issue for the Ukrainians is ammunition. Many Ukrainian units are now running out of ammunition. The prospects, as the United States looks to cut funding, in all probability there won't be another infusion of cash and military supplies to the Ukrainians until next year, if it happens. So that also is of great concern to the Ukrainian military. And then finally, the greatest concern, which could lead to the eventual collapse of the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian ground forces, is continued operations by Russian forces. The Russians, as we speak, are on the offensive in many sectors of the conflict. There is a continued offensive near Avdiivka. There are continued offensive operations near Bakhmut. And there are continued offensive operations within the vicinity of Kupiansk and other locales. Some would argue that the Russians could be preparing to renew storming operations near Avdiivka. It's very probable. Again, this is confirmed by multiple sources that the Russians are on the offensive in multiple sectors. Many Ukrainian units in these areas are reporting heavy losses, reduced capability because of lack of ammunition and personnel. Now, circling back towards the Ukrainian ability to recruit, train, and deploy soldiers. Obviously, in a high-intensity industrial conflict, the likes we are seeing in this conflict, you have to fully mobilize. And we're now starting to see the effects of continued mobilization and, more importantly, continued casualties on the part of the Ukrainian military. That is causing widespread draft dodging, conscript dodging. People like Denis Davidov getting smuggled out of Ukraine, fleeing the country, hiding in the country. And now, furthermore, we're starting to see organized groups of persons in Ukraine actively attacking recruiters, setting fire to recruiting stations, and refusing military service. Again, because of the casualty rates. The casualty rates are incredibly high. Incredibly high. Appalling casualty rates. And as I'd said before, the leading cause of that is the Ukrainians are fighting a war without essentially an air force against an opponent in the Russian Federation who has a very large air force. It is very difficult to fight that kind of war. Incredibly difficult. Now, the Ukrainians have done a very adequate job in defending Kiev in the early stages of the conflict, obviously. I believe the Russians were hoping to move as far west as Odessa, and the Ukrainians prevented that. Is it likely that the Russians will have renewed success and take Odessa? Probably not. I think that at this point, the best the Russians can hope for, given the situation on the ground, would be the capture of areas such as Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and quite possibly a renewed threat towards Kharkov. So again, as we had talked about in the opening, is the Ukrainian military on the verge of collapse? Possibly. When things happen, when you have the collapse of a military, of a fighting force, sometimes this happens very slowly and then suddenly quickens based on what's happening on the ground. I fear, at least for those supporters of the Ukrainian state and military, the Ukrainian military could be on the verge of a collapse. Now, what is that going to look like? Is it going to lead to a rapid expansion of Russian territorial control? It's difficult to say. But the situation right now for the Ukrainians, based on manpower, based on access to ammunition and the ability to continue to fight along the front lines, is not looking very good for the Ukrainians. So we'll continue to watch. We will continue to report. We're watching things very, very closely in and around Avdiivka. We anticipate that the Russians are going to pick up the pace in this sector, and we could ultimately observe the general collapse of the Avdiivka pocket. We'll continue to monitor this and report. As always, thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.